Evening, everybody. I hope you're well. Hope you're not freezing. Hope your days were good. So we got an hour together. And what's this session all about? Well, if we look back to what we did last week, we kind of explored maybe some ideas about how to communicate online through this strange machine when we're distanced from people. And we also looked at maybe ideas of how to begin a sermon. And we looked at how Billy Graham begins his sermons with a huge amount of empathy. He creates an environment where people feel understood. They feel empathized with, where their pain, their aspirations, their hopes, their fears are recognized. And then he leads them wonderfully to the foot of the cross. Now, what are we going to do this week? Well, this week we're going to look at a very simple idea, which is how on earth can the points that you want to make land? How can, if you like, if you've got a nail, how can you hammer that nail or those nails into the skulls of your audience? Because human beings there's a tsunami of information that gets us every day. I think somebody said, every single year, there is more information put into the public world through the internet than in every other year of human history combined. There's just a tsunami of words, of ideas, of messages, of information that come to us every day. So when you preach, how can the points that you believe God is making through this text land? How can they be remembered? And if you didn't watch the video, I'll just recap very briefly. I find this idea of how human beings remember ideas really interesting to me, because for many years I was an actor, so I just had to speak the lines. But for the last 20 years, I've been trying to help my clients tell their stories, my corporate clients. And I've noticed something actually, which is the mind of the audience hooks onto ideas if they're expressed in pictures. If they can see an idea, they can get an idea, they can understand it, they can remember it. So how do human beings remember? Well, let's just remind ourselves. If I asked you to remember a few things, just notice how your brain operates, how you remember those things. I'd love you to remember, if you can, the bedroom that you grew up in as a small child in your parents' house. Now I'd love you to remember what's on your bedside table at home now. Now I'd love you to remember the first car that you ever owned. How do we remember those things? I think we remember them in picture form. So actually, if we want to communicate an idea, we have to translate that idea into something that an audience can see. Let's call it a picture. And I don't mean a literal picture, although it could be. I don't mean PowerPoint. I don't mean clip art. I mean words that paint pictures. And Jesus was just brilliant at this. He was fantastic. He took deep, complex ideas and he turned them into pictures that anybody can see. And actually, if we read our Bibles, they're full of vivid, striking, extraordinary images, whether it's Paul, whether it's Jesus, whether it's the Old Testament, whether it's James, whatever it might be. So how do we actually incorporate that into making a point? Well, I'm working on the assumption that you've done your exegesis of the text, that you understood what God is trying to communicate to your audience at that time and that place, and you've got a few points that you want to make through the text. You know, the classic traditional is 3 points, a 3-point sermon. I mean, we haven't got time here and now to debate it. I would argue that particularly in the modern world, because our brains are so swamped, you need to make a decision as to which is your most important point, which is the point that you want them to remember on Thursday after lunch, because I don't think you can communicate 3. I'm not saying you only make 1 point, but I'm saying I think it's probably wise to make a decision as to what is your main point? What's the big idea that you want to communicate that they can remember in the week leading after the sermon? So I think there are 3 elements that you need in order to communicate that idea. And I'm not saying anything new. What we're going to do today is in some way very obvious, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves. What we need to communicate a point are 3 things. We need to be able to, I'll stand here. We need to be able to state the point very clearly. we need to be able to explain the point, and then we need to be able to illustrate the point. I'm sure you've heard this before: state, explain, illustrate. So, for example, let's take it. So, to state a point, COVID is bad. What? The explain. We have to explain. Why is COVID bad? Well, COVID is bad because it kills people. It wrecks the economy. It strips us of unemployment opportunities and jobs. It destroys our natural way of being together as human beings. There are all sorts of reasons why COVID is bad. And then a good communicator would illustrate that. So how would they illustrate that? There are 4 very simple ways to illustrate any point, any idea. The first is facts. So let's take another idea. I'm going to state that AIDS is decimating Africa. Explain, why is AIDS decimating Africa? AIDS is decimating Africa because it is killing off an entire generation of men and women. And how will I illustrate that? Well, let me give you some facts. I got this from the BBC a few years ago. If you take last year, 1/3 of Malawi's entire education budget for the year is spent just burying teachers who've died of AIDS. 1/3 of a country's aid budget spent on funerals. Now that's just shocking. Those facts take an idea and they make them concrete, they make pictorial. The second obvious way is to illustrate a point, is to quote the opinion of other people. So, for example, if I was talking about AIDS in Africa, I could quote what Nelson Mandela says about AIDS in Africa, and that would have a weight. In preaching terms, if I want to make a point, I could quote what Tim Keller says about it, or what John Stott says about it, or whoever it is that your audience would take seriously and find credible. The third way of being able to communicate an idea and to illustrate it is using anecdotes. Anecdotes are stories. So let's take Jesus, for example. We remember, and the people who listened to him at the time remember the stories that he told. The story of the prodigal son, that wonderful story that has echoed down 2,000 years of Christian history and still has a huge weight when we tell it. And last but not least, we can illustrate an idea using metaphors. Jesus was fantastic. Let's say he was communicating about the kingdom of heaven. Can you think of 3 metaphors that he used to bring alive and to illustrate the idea of the kingdom of heaven? The kingdom of heaven is like, well, it's like a mustard seed. It's like a man who built his house on a rock. It's like, I'm sure you can think of many others. Now, what does a metaphor do? A metaphor takes an idea and it turns it into a picture or a series of pictures. So let's take, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Now, this saves me having to use a huge amount of long, abstract language. It saves me having to say, I'm talking about the looking for a small object in a large context, which will take an extended period of time and may well prove fruitless. It takes an idea and it makes it concrete. And that's what illustrations do. So actually, you know, if you look back at human history, well before we could understand the sentence, tigers are extremely dangerous and should be avoided at all costs, we could recognize that stripy thing running towards us and take, with its mouth open, looking hungry, and take evasive action. What the worst communicators do, so images have been with us forever. We take decisions on the basis of what we see. And what the bad communicators do, what the worst communicators do, is they take ideas and they communicate them in language which might explain something, but they explain it in abstract terms. I'll use some language from my world, the world of corporate life. The functionality of our integrated solution set, delivering added value resource management frameworks to the stakeholders within the organization in order to deliver enhanced benefits in the short to medium term. Now, did you understand any of that? Well, neither do I, but people in my world use that language, big, long words, which they think explains an idea, but the audience don't get it, they don't receive it, because it doesn't illustrate it. And actually, what was remarkable about Jesus's teaching, it was so clear, it was so simple, it was so visible. Because the truth is, actually, for the last 2,000 years, and if you look around now, There are people who preach and they use long words and they use abstract words that seek to explain gospel truths, but actually the audience doesn't get it. And particularly during COVID, I've been thinking of people who might come on a sermon online, but imagine a 28-year-old that has never set foot in a church before. And some of the language that we use and we think communicates an idea, but they don't get it. We talk about sanctification. We talk about coming to the foot of the cross. We talk about Jesus dying for our sins on the cross. Those ideas are wonderful and they're true, but sometimes they're very abstract. So rather than me talking any more about this, I'll give you an example of me trying to communicate an idea using this methodology, and then you can have a go. So I'm going to try and tell you about a place called Bushfire. So my statement, my point, if you like, is I think Bushfire is an inspirational place in the world. Your brain now wants an explanation. Why do you think that, Richard? Well, actually what it does is it provides homes for kids who have no mums and dads and no homes. It's an orphanage. That's my explanation. There still aren't any concrete pictures, so I'll give you some facts. 7 + 7. I'll give you an opinion from the guy who started the orphanage to do with hope. I'll tell you a little story about a girl, Betty, and I'll give you a metaphor. It's a bit like an oasis. Now I'll put the timer on myself because one of the things I want to explore this evening is how you can communicate a point without writing a script. We sort of talked a little bit about this last week. I mean, I would contend that actually it's almost impossible to write a sermon that when it's read out sounds like a real human being talking. It might be incredibly accurate, but actually it misses something of the vitality of when a human being stands up and communicates from the heart and from the head at the same time. So I'm going to put a timer on myself. I'll give myself, let's say, 2.5 minutes, and I will try and communicate this idea to you. So, and afterwards, we'll kind of notice or have a go at noticing which bits really land with you. So I'll have a go and I'll point to the bit that I'm doing as I go through. Start. So the thing I'm going to tell you about this evening is a place called Bushfire, which I think is really inspiring. Why is it inspiring? Well, because it takes kids in Uganda who have no homes, no mums, no dads, and it gives them homes and mums and dad. You know, and all the parents in the orphanage are inspiring. If you can imagine this, you're a married couple, you move into the middle of the African bush, you build a house, it has 3 rooms. In one room, you put 7 beds for the 7 orphan boys that you adopt. In the second room, you put another 7 beds for the 7 orphan girls you adopt. And in the third room, that's your bedroom. And that's where everybody eats and where your children sleep as well. These are extraordinary couples. And I was talking to Sam, who founded this orphanage, and he said there was no hope in this community. AIDS had decimated it, and I just wanted to bring hope. And that's exactly what he's done. I can remember meeting a young girl called Betty. It was on my last day there. It was about 8:30 in the morning. All the other kids were in school, except this little girl. She was about 8 years old, and she was doing the washing up for everybody else in the community, 150 people. Now, I've got 3 children. I can't often remember them volunteering to do the washing up. But I said to Joseph, why is she doing the washing up? And he said, well, I'm not making her do the washing up. She's too sick with malaria to go to school. She's volunteering to do the washing up. And then Joseph told me her story. When she was 6-year-old, her father died of AIDS. And then her mother, who was actually a prostitute to earn money, was dying of AIDS. So you're a 6-year-old little girl and you are caring for your dying mother. Sadly, her mother died. And she was alone with her dead mother for a week in a hut in the middle of the African bush. Then her relatives found her. And sadly, in that part of Uganda, they actually started to beat and abuse her. And then Sam, this pastor, found her and then brought her to this orphanage, this place Bushfire. And now she's got the smile of an angel and she's volunteering to do the washing up when she's too sick to go to school. And that place is full of children like that. And it's incredibly inspiring. You know, it's a little bit like Africa is a bit like a desert. AIDS has decimated it. And in the middle of that desert is an oasis of joy and light and laughter and love. And that's Bushfire. So I've got 5 seconds left. Great. So I'd love you to close your eyes, if you can, just for 10 seconds, and see what you remember from the 2.5 minutes that I talked. Which picture was most vivid to you? Now, I can't see you, but I'm going to ask you, I guess, to put up your hand if it was the story of the little girl. And if it was, actually Stanford University in America have done a very interesting study, and they found that if you communicate an idea using a story, it becomes 22 times more memorable. Now, what's interesting to me is Stanford, 2,000 years after Jesus was doing that, have uncovered the science of why Jesus told stories, because stories enable us to remember an idea. And later on this evening, we're going to look at how do you tell a story. But first of all, I want to give you an opportunity to play around with this. So here's my basic point. My basic point is that once you've done your exegesis and you've got a number of points going through the text that you want to make, you can only make those points if you don't just state them and give them a theoretical explanation, but if you also illustrate them using one or more of these. You don't have to use all 4, but at least one illustration that's really powerful for each point. I think of it like this, to use a metaphor. I have a cup of black coffee in the morning. If you take, what do I need in order to drink a cup of coffee? I need the coffee, that's like the statement. I need the water, that's like the explanation, but I can't drink the coffee unless it's in a cup. An illustration is like a cup. It enables the coffee to be drunk, to be consumed. And when we take our point and we state it and explain it, and we then serve it in an illustration, it allows the audience to consume that point so that it goes down, so that it changes lives. So how are we going to do this? I'd like you to take a sheet of A4 paper, and I'd like you to write, or your notebook, whatever paper you've got in front of you, and to just write, state, explain, illustrate. And then write down facts, opinions, anecdotes, metaphors, if you can do that while I'm talking. And what I'm going to do is to ask you to put together a 2-minute explanation of your church, the church that you go to, so that somebody else can understand it, and wonderfully so. So let's start. I'd like you to write down, opposite state, I'd like you to write down the name of your church. The name of your church, and just one word to describe it. It might be inspiring, amazing, wonderful, exciting. Just one word to describe that church. So that's your statement. I'd then like you to write one reason as to why you like your church so much. So it might be because of the outreach that we do in the community, the difference that we make, the services that we do. So it might be the way that you provide a food program, or whatever it might be, or it might be the thing that you really love about your church is the quality of the preaching and the sermons, or it might be the fact that you love each other so much. You're such a really tight, wonderful community. Whatever it is, I'd love you to give one reason why you love your church so much. So you've got the name of the church and a word to describe it. St. Paul's is really exciting. And then give one reason for that. It might be, it might be the quality of the preaching, whatever it might be. And then we're going to do some work into illustrating it. So where do we start? Let's start, we'll start with the hardest job, the metaphor. Our church is a little bit like what? What metaphor could you use to describe your church? I talked about bushfire. I said it was like an oasis in the middle of a desert. Other people, there's a friend of mine who runs a church in St. Helens. He says, our church seeks to be like a lighthouse. What's the metaphor that you would use to describe to somebody, to a stranger, your church? I'm going to give just 30 seconds of silence. And if anything comes, don't worry if it doesn't, just write it opposite the word metaphor. Now I'd love you to think of some facts, maybe. Some facts to bring alive this idea. Are there any numbers? Are there any facts that you could communicate to bring alive this idea of your church that you're trying to communicate? To make it concrete. I'll give 30 seconds, and if there are, just write it opposite the word facts. Great. Now let's think about an anecdote, a little story. If you had to tell me a story, a little short story, let's say a minute, 40 seconds, something to bring alive the aspect of this church. So for example, if you're trying to communicate how great the sermons are in the church, you might tell a story of a particular sermon and how it changed you, or how it changed a friend of yours or somebody you know, or brought somebody to Christ, whatever it might be. If it's maybe you're trying to illustrate the idea that actually it's your outreach into the community and how you serve the community. Maybe an old lady who she lost her husband and the church would bring her meals, whatever. What story would you tell? I'll give you 30 seconds. And if a story comes to mind, just jot it down on this piece of paper, as few words as possible. Great. And last but not least, a quote from somebody else. Is there anybody else who's said to you about the church, about this thing, about how maybe if you're talking about the sermons, how the sermons have been fantastic and life-changing, or maybe somebody who remarked on the quality of service that you are in the community. So any quote that comes to mind that's relevant to illustrating this point that you're trying to make. Again, 30 seconds. Don't worry if nothing comes to mind, but if something does, just jot it down opposite opinions, as few words as possible, just to remind yourself of what that point is. Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask George to split us into pairs. You've got 8 minutes, and I'd like in the pairs just to take it in turns, 2 minutes and then 2 minutes. And the first person who goes, just take 2 minutes to communicate your church to this other individual. So I love my church. So imagine they were saying to you, tell me about your church. You said the name of the church. You gave a reason why you love it. And then just go through these. Give the facts, the opinions, a little story, and a metaphor. So 8 minutes. And when you finish your 2 minutes, because the first person goes, then the next person goes, then you can give a little bit of feedback, maybe what you liked, what you enjoyed, any thoughts of how it could be even better. And I'll see you in 8 minutes.
Done.
Great. George, did that make sense?
Yeah, no, that made perfect sense. Yeah. I quite enjoyed that actually. It's just kind of amazing how you can put a story together, do you know, and just by using that, do you know, it was really, really good. I really enjoyed that illustration as well. We have just put down our church. It's an exciting church, and one of the good things about us is our unity within the church. Basically,